Welcome to True Crime by Indie Drop-In. Each week we feature an episode from the best independent creators. Hit subscribe for more great true crime content. If you would like to help Indie Drop-In support indie creators, you can buy us a coffee. Just go to buymeacoffee.com/indie drop-in or click the link in the show notes below. Today's episode is from What's Wrong With Them, a true crime diagnostic podcast. What's Wrong With Them is a psychological evaluation and diagnosis of famous criminals. If you like this episode of What's Wrong With Them, check the show notes for links to subscribe and follow on social media. Enjoy the show.
Begin.
Hi, friends. It's season 2. This is What's Wrong With Them, a true crime diagnostic podcast, and I am your host, Adair. This season, we are going to be covering killer kids. All kids that kill people. There's going to be kids that are school shooters, kids that kill their parents, kids that kill other kids. And it's going to be, I think, a really interesting discussion on most of these people. But we are going to start big because go hard or go home. And our first episode is going to be on Columbine, of course. Columbine was a school shooting and was one of the first ones of its kind. So it was not the first school shooting, and that actually will be our second episode, but it was huge in terms of very much covered on the news, the body count, the kids, their ages working together, all of that kind of stuff really made this kind of like the catalyst for a lot of school shootings, and it led to some helpful things and some not so helpful things, and we'll talk about that. But I'm focusing on Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, who were the two shooters in the Columbine High School massacre on April 20th, 1999. Before we get into it, I'm going to read my disclaimer. I am a licensed therapist in the state of California. These are not formal diagnoses, but rather a discussion about potential diagnosis or signs of potential diagnoses based on information gathered about the following person. In order to formally diagnose someone, I would need to conduct a thorough assessment with that person. With that said, let's talk about what's wrong with them. As I mentioned and introduced, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold were the two school shooters at Columbine High School in Colorado on April 20th, 1999. Okay, first, there is so much about this case that this could be hours and hours of episodes, and I'm not going to do that. But I do want to clear up some things that I definitely feel like are inaccurate. So a lot of people say that they were like Nazi sympathizers and all this other stuff, and that's why they did their shooting on April 20th, which is Hitler's birthday. But actually, it was planned for the 19th in order to honor Timothy McVeigh, the Unabomber, and the Oklahoma City bombing. They were actually far, far more influenced by Timothy McVeigh than Hitler or Nazis or anything like that. They did have a mutual interest in military history. That, of course, includes World War II, but that's actually not why they did this on that day, on 4/20. It was not originally planned for that. It was planned for the 19th. So at the time, it was the deadliest school shooting. It was really the first of its kind. And because of that, there was no police or SWAT protocol like we have now. So as I mentioned, this leads to a lot of stuff, good and bad. One of the things that it did lead to was protocol for school shootings. Unfortunately, we have to do that, and that really sucks. And I think too, as we talk about children in this season, I want to clarify that there is no blame on anybody. Like, we're of course going to talk about nature versus nurture and that idea of like parents and family. And of course we talk about that, but just because somebody has a hard life doesn't mean that they're going to murder people, doesn't mean that they're going to kill anybody or do any crimes at all. But in this case, more than anything, I absolutely blame the government and our shitty gun laws here in the US, because this case should have led to a lot of gun reform, and it didn't. It led to more school shootings, and it led to more people saying that Columbine and Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold were actually influences of theirs and people that they looked up to and people that inspired them to then do their own school shootings. And we're going to talk about the NRA because that's actually part of this storyline. But let me tell you a little bit about them. We're going to start with Eric Harris. So Eric Harris is actually 18 at the time of this, technically an adult, but barely. He was still in high school. And I'm starting with him because he is often referred to as the primary in this case, where a lot of people kind of say that Dylan was the follower and Eric was really the person who came up with this. He was, quote, the psychopath. Being 18 at the time of the shooting kind of changes diagnostic stuff for us, but of course, we're not even there yet. I haven't even started. So Eric Harris was born April 9th, 1981. His mother, Catherine Poole, was a homemaker, and his father, Wayne Harris, was a Air Force pilot, which is kind of cool and also led to a lot of Eric's interest in military history and eventually his decision to apply to be in the military. But because of his father's work, they moved around a lot. He never really lived anywhere long enough to make a whole lot of friends. Very nomadic lifestyle. But most people described him as a normal kid. He said, and there are journals, so haven't got to that yet, but there are journals, so a lot of information about what these kids thought at the time is based on those journals. And we can't be 100% sure that those things were accurate or honest or really anything like that. They could have just been writing to write. They could have been making shit up. We have no idea. But in that and in reports from other kids and schools and whatever, Eric reported that moving around was difficult. And he said that he was always at the bottom of the ladder because he never really got to connect deeply with people and stay somewhere long enough. But him and Dylan, they met in 7th grade because they worked together in a pizza shop. They became really good friends and they spent a lot of time together. They had similar interests and they ended up doing these things called the basement tapes. The basement tapes are basically these visual audio journals where both Eric and Dylan would create storylines or kind of just talk about what was going on. And these eventually get referenced after the shooting. Eric had also bragged a bit about his ability to deceive other people, stating on one of those tapes that he could make anybody believe anything. He was known at school as being quick to anger. He threatened people with bombs. He was fascinated by war, wrote violent fantasies about killing people. And he had some, not just the journals that he kept, but also a website. And on his website, he really wrote about all the things that he absolutely hated. And one of those things actually is Nazis and racism. So that's where we can kind of rule out this idea of them being influenced by that. But some of those, maybe more thoughtful and helpful and agreeable statements also lead to, well, we should just kill them all. So obviously that's not the goal. But if you started reading some of his website, you might be like, yeah, I agree with this kid, bullies suck. Nazis suck. Absolutely. But then he goes on to these really violent fantasies. People in school say that they were bullied, but not bullied more than anybody else. And in fact, that they bullied other people. This is where there's kind of this rumor mill that happens with Columbine, and that happens with high school generally, but that they were these kind of outcasts and they hated the jocks and the trench coat mafia and all this other stuff that maybe isn't as extreme or as accurate as we always thought it was. So Eric has this history, right? He has some other crimes and things that he's also caught with. So one of those things is that on January 30th, 1998, Eric and Dylan broke into a locked van, stole some computers and other electronic equipment. They were pulled over while driving away. He admitted to the theft. They were charged with breaking and entering, trespassing, and theft. They actually left really good impressions on the officers and I'm guessing therapists, and they eventually expunged their criminal records if they agreed to attend a diversion program, which included community service and psychiatric treatment. This is where we get the journals. So Eric himself was also required to attend an anger management class and left a good impression. Probation officers eventually discharged them from the program early for good behavior. But he has multiple police reports. He has this military obsession, and he actually was making chemical weapons at home. There's a really good documentary about them, and one of the things that they talk about is the Anarchist Cookbook, which is referenced a lot in like school shooters, bombing, stuff like that. But Eric was actually like practicing making some of these weapons at home, like literally like making napalm at home. So already like very early, and of course these are kids, so very early, is their entire lives. But he is pretty well known for kind of being like a troublemaker. And I think that's how he ends up getting this idea of being the primary, of being like the main perpetrator of the shootings. While in this diversion program, they had to write in their journals. And those are what get referenced the most in terms of who they were, their behaviors, all of that kind of stuff, the things that they wrote about, the things that they thought about themselves. And of course, we have to take that with a grain of salt because, again, if you consider that maybe they were like, nobody's ever going to read these, I can just make up stories, or my therapist is absolutely going to read this, I'm going to write what they want me to write. We can't necessarily say that these were completely honest and accurate, and we can't make diagnoses off of that either. But I do think that their journals are important and what they wrote about is purposeful, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But before we get into the actual shooting, I'm going to tell you about Dylan Klebold. Dylan Klebold is often known as kind of the secondary or the follower in this situation, but we are not taking away the fact that he killed people. He shot people. He was absolutely part of this. And even if he maybe wasn't the person that came up with the idea, he participated in it. And so to call him like the secondary or the follower, I think really does kind of like take away the fact that he is just as guilty. Dylan Klebold was born on September 11th, 1981 in Colorado. His parents, Tom and Sue, were these kind of like hippie people. So Thomas actually started as a sculptor and then moved over to engineering to make more money. And Sue had worked in services with disabled children. They were pacifists. They were Lutheran. They went to church every weekend, did all the things. Dylan was described by everybody, teachers, other students, as being painfully shy. It said that he was always really fidgety when somebody new talked to him, that he was rarely opening up to people, but also was described as being more popular than Eric. There's history of him having girlfriends and actually having some other friends outside of Eric, where Eric was maybe more of the loner. Again, the journals get referenced. So a lot of the stuff they're obviously doing together. They met in 7th grade. The theft and all of that they do together. But in his journals, and Dylan's journals are really interesting, he expresses some things that look a little bit like psychosis or paranoia or delusions. He wrote about aliens. He wrote about not being real or alive. He wrote about not being accepted or loved, being godlike. He used the words human form very often, seemed very detached from himself, and also discussed his inability to connect emotionally and sexually with girls. This, given that he was 17 at the time, could be, again, him just writing to write, being creative, doing these things. And they actually were very creative kids. Like, they did these movies together and did write, and Dylan was a really good writer, like creative writing. But nonetheless, this is concerning to me. And that's what I would look at, honestly. If I'm looking for a diagnosis, if I'm looking to diagnose him, I would be looking at the things that he writes in these journals. And that's not all, but there's some other stuff in there that definitely makes me think about some different diagnoses, like maybe autism, but more than anything, potentially schizoaffective disorder, maybe a psychotic disorder. A lot of the stuff that I read actually talked about schizotypal personality disorder. Technically, being 17, we cannot diagnose him with a personality disorder. We can say it looks like that. And yeah, sometimes you can diagnose people earlier than 18, and being 17, he's very close to being 18. So the personality disorder is an option, but technically, they have to be 18. His mother, Sue, has gone on to do TED Talks and write a book and do all this other stuff. And she always says that he had a really normal childhood, that really she didn't catch like red flags. However, outside of that burglary, Dylan also had at one point hacked the school computers for locker combinations of people that he didn't like. That is kind of interesting to say that this person, isn't the psychopath, isn't the criminal in quotes, but yet he has also a criminal record. And of course, as I mentioned, he shot people. He killed people. We're not taking any accountability away from him. So, they've known each other for a long time. They actually have been very much planning their shooting. Eric was making weapons at home, and originally they were trying to do this on April 19th to commemorate, I guess, Timothy McVeigh and the Oklahoma bombing. Okay, two separate things, just to separate real quick. Timothy McVeigh is the Unabomber. The Oklahoma City bombing is separate, but happened on the same day, different years. Okay. So they planned to set off these bombs. That was their original plan, was basically to bomb the school and shoot people as they fled. Obviously, that's not how it worked. But I do think it makes the whole like Timothy McVeigh thing seem a little bit more plausible, knowing that they actually planned this to be a bombing. Leading up to this day, again, they had been planning, very much planning. They knew when they were going to do it. And there are basement tapes. There are tapes of them saying goodbye. There are tapes of Dylan, apologizing to his parents. There's tapes of Eric, who says multiple times, like to friends, if you survive, you can have whatever you want from my room. If you survive, you can have this. And that, I think, is very telling about his capacity for empathy, to know that he didn't really care if his friend survived or not. But again, taking into account that they were planning on bombing the school and not knowing exactly who was going to die or where they were going to be. Outside of the tapes, they wrote about it in each other's yearbooks. And there's a very eerie photo. There's a school photo. You guys can Google it. Maybe I'll post it on our Instagram. But there's a school photo where it looks like a normal school photo. But if you zoom in and you look at this top left corner, I think, you'll see Dylan and Eric and I think like one or two more people who are pretending to shoot the cameraman. That's what they look like. It's very eerie, knowing what was going to happen. On the day of April 20th, 1999, they planned to set off a bomb out elsewhere, not at the school. And they actually were going to do that to distract the police, to give themselves more time. So they go and they plant this bomb. They head over to the school. They wear trench coats to hide weapons. And this is where we get the whole trench coat mafia thing, which there are conflicting reports on that actually was a thing, but that maybe they were not part of it. Not really sure. But they did wear trench coats to hide weapons, and they brought explosives, their bombs, their homemade propane tank bombs in duffel bags into the cafeteria. They brought them into the cafeteria because, again, very planned out, they had them set to go off at a particular time. And that was when the most people in the school would be at lunch. The cafeteria is also directly underneath the library, and their hope was that when the bomb went off, not only would it kill all the people in the cafeteria, it would cave in the roof and it would kill most of the people in the library, because their goal was body count. They did not care who they killed. It was completely random, and their goal was simply to kill people. In total, they had 99 weapons: pipe bombs, car bombs, their guns, the propane tank bombs, 99 total weapons. And they were very strategic. So they dropped that one bomb off like away to hopefully distract the police. They drive to the school. They park their cars with the car bombs in them in places where they believed that ambulances and paramedics and people would park. So they were hoping to kill them too. Well, they don't know this, but that bomb that they planted to distract the police never went off. But they are on a time schedule. Believing that it had gone off, they go into the cafeteria. They drop off those bombs, but they, of course, don't go off. And when they don't go off, Eric and Dylan walk into the cafeteria and they start shooting. And they are shooting randomly, and they are going up and down the halls, and they are laughing, and they're shooting the walls and the ceilings. They're looking into classrooms, but not necessarily shooting people in there. They're just shooting. Dylan apparently would let people go. He would maybe ask some questions and then walk away. And this is, again, where people are like, oh, he didn't really want to do this. No, he wanted to do this. But I do think it's an interesting insight into his psyche and maybe his own thoughts about himself, his possible delusions, things like that, that also are very important as to why he was doing this, his motive behind the shooting. The shooting as a whole only lasted 15 minutes. People think that this was like a very long day. And it was a long day, and we'll get to that, but the shooting itself only lasted 15 minutes. 911 calls are being done by students and staff. There are horrible recordings. You can listen to them if you want to do that to yourself. I've listened to them. They're very interesting, but they are very real. They're literal, they're actual 911 calls and recordings. So many people, 1999, cell phones are pretty new. So many people were calling 911 that 911 got full. People just started calling media outlets. The media gets there before cops do. And the kids go up to the library. This is where we get some again, rumors, some things that are inaccurate, and some of those recordings can prove that. They ask jocks to stand up, or anybody like wearing a white hat, which apparently was like a sign of being a jock. And when they don't, or nobody does what they say, they just randomly start shooting again. They also have this interaction that is interesting, to say the least.
As we're listening to Adair talk all about Columbine, I wanted to tell you about a book called Columbine by David Cullen. This book is widely considered the definitive account of the Columbine massacre, its aftermath, and its significance. If you didn't know, David Cullen was one of the first journalists on the scene. Cullen draws on mountains of evidence, insight from the world's leading forensic psychologists, and the killer's own words and drawings several reproduced in this book. Cullen paints a picture of two polar opposite killers and starkly contrast it with the flashes of resilience and redemption among the survivors. After you listen to Adair talk about Columbine, if you want to go that next step deeper, I'll put a link to Columbine by David Cullen down in the show notes to make it easy to click. We'll get right back to the show after a couple words from our sponsors.
At one point, they pull this girl and ask her if she believes in God. And she says yes. And during this interaction, like they're laughing and whatever, they actually end up, and I think it's Dylan, actually ends up walking away and not killing her. Okay, this story gets very misconstrued because there was another girl in the library, Cassie, who was shot. And some other student that survived this massacre said that it was Cassie that Dylan asked, "Do you believe in God?" And when she said yes, he shot her. Cassie's parents went on to become like public speakers and basically make their kid this like Presbyterian martyr. Okay, I went to Catholic school. Those parents came to my fucking school. They came to my school and talked about how God saves and blah, 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 all this crazy shit. Not even their kid. Not even their kid. It was a girl that survived. She's told the story, but basically this took off so quickly that her storyline has basically gotten lost. And that is one of the things I would like to clear up, that they were not Satanists. They didn't shoot people because of their religion. And another piece is that they did use some inappropriate language. They referred to one of the Black students using the N-word. And people then say, oh, well, this is race related. But I think that they did whatever they could to hurt people. And that meant making fun of people and using harsh language and doing these other things to make them feel strong and powerful. Again, on Eric's website, where he talks about all the things he hates, he talks about racists. And he talks about how he hates racism and that it doesn't make sense. And that doesn't mean that he's not racist, but it is something that I think is important to point out. They are trying to set off the bombs. Okay, so after this whole thing in the library, they go back down to the cafeteria because the bombs never went off. So they're shooting at the bombs, and they eventually start a small fire. They're laughing, they're woohooing, and Dylan is walking around taking drinks off the tables. Like, again, the school is basically trying to be evacuated. So kids are hiding, kids have run out, the fire starts, fire alarms going off, whatever. And he's just like drinking sodas off the table, which again is an interesting insight into his psyche. The shooting again only lasted about 15 minutes, and then they killed themselves. The difficult part about this was that because they came in trench coats, multiple reports were there are kids in trench coats. Then they took off their trench coats, and then kids were like, they were two kids wearing this stuff. So police thought that there were at least 4 shooters. Again, they did not have protocol. It took the police and SWAT 3 hours to clear out the school. They didn't know how many shooters there were. They didn't have any protocol, thought there were like 4 more. And of course, they do clear it all out at the same time. It's the only thing that is on the news. Every news station is covering this. It was literally front page news for like 20 weeks following. The following week, the week after this literal massacre where 15 children died, including the 2 shooters, the NRA comes to town. Yes, the National Rifle Association comes to town, and they say, get your guns. Second Amendment, baby. And that is the only place where I can place any blame, because what the fuck? That, like, I can't imagine being a parent of one of those children that died and then having the NRA show up. That's insane. Because let's talk about how they got their guns. They were underage. They could not legally purchase firearms. And so they asked another student, actually an 18-year-old Columbine student, an old friend of Dylan's, to make what is called a straw purchase of 2 shotguns in exchange for his cooperation and eventually reporting that no charges were filed against him. Dylan sawed off his 12-gauge double-barrel shotgun, and Eric also sawed off his shotgun, which we already know is like its own illegal situation. But again, the week after this, okay, this child, basically 18 years old, but is still in high school. The week after this child illegally gives guns to other people, the NRA comes to town. I do think, though, that after this, it led to a couple beneficial things, which was closing the gun show loophole. And I'm not going to get into that's like a whole thing. But I do think, if I remember correctly, that in Colorado, they closed that because that's what they did. That's how they got this. It was through loopholes and then, of course, illegally selling them to other people. The other things that came out of Columbine were a lot of anti-bullying. As someone who was bullied, I don't know if it was super helpful. But a lot of people said that after this, a lot of the kids basically got together to be like, okay, we don't want more of this. Let's just be decent to one another, which is great. And it led to a lot of discussion about bullying in the news. It did lead to maybe some beneficial things. Kind of interesting, though, that, again, they weren't like the worst bullied people. They also bullied other people. But it did lead to conversation. I think that conversation is helpful. It also led to a lot of zero tolerance. And that's problematic for a few reasons. And of course, we could get into that. But zero tolerance, of course, leads to kids being like suspended and expelled, removed from spaces that they probably need to be in. It also punishes people fighting back. So if you're being bullied or somebody hits you and you hit them back, you are also suspended, which I think is a problem. It also led to increased school security, which is just militarizing our schools and their security, which is not the purpose of school. Again, in my perfect world, this would have led to a huge change in gun laws and saying like, y'all are not to be trusted. Take these away. We can't do it anymore. But instead they said, you know what? You know what we need? We need to give some high school security officers guns because good guys with guns can stop the bad guys with guns. And obviously we have learned that that doesn't fucking work because you know what else Columbine led to? Fucking copycat killers. So many people, including Sandy Hook, reference Columbine, reference Dylan and Eric as being influences and people that they looked up to. There are Dylan and Eric fan clubs. There are people that are like, yes, they did what needed to be done, which is so problematic. This also led to the immediate action rapid deployment tactic, which is the police and SWAT protocol to now go in, identify who the shooter are and take who they are and take them down. Not going through to clear everything out first, which is why it took so long for them to know that the shooting was done and over with and that Eric and Dylan had killed themselves. Columbine also led to discussion of teenage antidepressant use, which can increase suicidality, and really just diagnosing kids. Is that beneficial? Are we overdiagnosing, underdiagnosing? What are we looking for? All of that. Then we get the super fun arguments that have been disproved a million times, but people still like to talk about them, which is music and video games. Marilyn Manson was the topic of conversation for a long time, which again was actually misreported. People said that they were wearing Marilyn Manson, what's the word I'm looking for? wearing like his merchandise, wearing people said that they were wearing Marilyn Manson merchandise, and they were not. Actually, again, in the journals and the website, they didn't actually like Marilyn Manson. But Marilyn Manson, out of respect and out of so many people fucking talking about him, he cancels the rest of his tour in honor of the kids that died. He is interviewed at one point and is asked, and I think this is beautiful, is asked if you could talk to Eric and Dylan, what would you say to them? And he says, I wouldn't say anything. I would listen, which is what everyone else should have done. The other discussion that comes up is about video games. Eric and Dylan spent a lot of time playing video games. And I think Doom was one of them, where actually you can find what are called Harris maps, which were these maps that Eric and Dylan made together. But, do video games make people more violent? Do video games lead to depression or to suicidality or to school shootings? No, they don't. There's actually tons of research. They don't in any way. If anything, video games lead to people having faster reflexes and making better doctors. Doesn't actually lead to any violence. So, that is a story. The very, very sad and tragic fucking story of the Columbine High School massacre. You might be asking yourself, wow, Adair, that's fucking terrible. Why would they do something like that? What is wrong with them? Well, let me tell you about it. Okay, I'm looking at a couple different things here. First of all, I do think they both have conduct disorder. Conduct disorder being the minor or the childhood diagnosis that could eventually turn into antisocial personality disorder. And the reason that I say that is, one, they both committed crimes. They bullied others, they threatened people, they intimidated people, they had weapons, their previous thefts, breaking and entering, deceitfulness or theft, lying to other people, disturbance in behavior, all that kind of stuff. So definitely meet criteria for that. I also think that potentially they both had major depressive disorder. Maybe Dylan more than Eric. And again, a lot of people say like, oh, Eric wanted to kill and Dylan wanted to die, and that made this deadly combination. If that is true, that might say something about their depression. If Dylan wanted to die, that might be because he was depressed. If they were bullied in the way that a lot of people say that they were, or that reports are, that can absolutely lead to major depressive disorder or PTSD. But feeling sad, feeling hopeless, feeling helpless, feeling like people don't listen to you, feeling just down, tearful, diminished interest and pleasure, weight loss or changes in eating, issues with sleeping, psychomotor agitation, which could explain potentially like the fidgeting that Dylan would do, fatigue, loss of energy, feeling worthless, issues concentrating or thinking. They were skipping a lot of class. That's not necessarily because of that, but could be. Thoughts of death. All of that basically just to say, I think that they both could fit that. As I mentioned, Dylan is 17. Okay, so he's technically a minor, which means we cannot diagnose him with a personality disorder. However, most things that I found do discuss him having schizotypal personality disorder, and let me tell you what that is. You can make decisions for yourself. It's a pervasive pattern of social and interpersonal deficits marked by an acute discomfort with and reduced capacity for close relationships, as well as by cognitive or perceptual distortions and eccentricities of behavior, beginning in early adulthood and present in a variety of contexts, including ideas of reference. He referred to himself as a godlike creature, odd beliefs or magical thinking, again, that he was in his human form, aliens, that kind of stuff, bizarre fantasies, unusual perceptual experiences or body illusions. I don't know of any of that. Odd thinking or speech, Don't really know, but that could be like vague, circumstantial, over elaborate, suspiciousness or paranoid ideation. Definitely think he has that. Inappropriate or constricted affect, him not really demonstrating emotion might be, again, why people thought he was very shy or couldn't connect with other people. Behavior or appearance that is odd, eccentric, or peculiar. I do think that, as some people said, survivors of this said that they were weird. They were weird kids, and that's why they were bullied. Lack of close friends or confidants other than first-degree relatives. Obviously, he has Eric, but he writes about not having a lot of friends. People in the school basically say otherwise, but that, again, could be a symptom of something, saying that he is not understanding that he has connections with people. Lastly, social anxiety. So I do think that he shows a lot of that. I do. Again, technically, we cannot diagnose him with a personality disorder. I would also want to look at paranoid personality disorder, but I think he fits closer with schizotypal than with paranoid. The other thing to look at with him, again, is this delusion of being like this godlike creature, being in his human form, being from a different planet, different world, all that kind of stuff could be a delusional disorder, which we've talked about last episode. But again, just these kind of like having delusions, but not necessarily having impaired behavior, not having the mood stuff like bipolar disorder. And I think, again, we would need to look at schizoaffective disorder, which really does look like bipolar disorder, but where the psychosis is paramount, is first. And we would look at the fact that he was depressed, and that's part of schizoaffective, that he had these kind of bizarre thinking patterns. Hard to tell, hard to differentiate these without, of course, being able to ask a bunch of questions. I would also want to look at paranoid personality disorder for Eric, because he very much believed that people didn't like him, didn't respect him, whatever these were. So paranoid personality disorder. Okay. And again, Eric is technically 18, so he could have antisocial personality disorder over conduct disorder, and he could be diagnosed with paranoid personality disorder as well. But that would be a distrust and suspiciousness of other people or motives being interpreted as malevolent, which I do think explains his ideas behind, like, people don't like him, I have to kill people. Like, I do think that it kind of makes sense. So again, suspects without basis that other people are exploiting, harming, or deceiving him, preoccupied with unjustified doubts about the loyalty or trustworthiness of other people, friends, associates, reluctant to confide in others, reads hidden or threatening meanings into events, meaning like people aren't actually saying that, he's taking it that way. Bears grudges. Perceives attacks on their character or reputation that are actually not really happening or not very apparent, and is quick to react angrily or to counterattack. Has suspicions without justification regarding fidelity. He wasn't in a relationship, but that could apply. So again, something just to consider, maybe again, a motive behind this was that they were a little bit paranoid. They did think that people didn't like them. And that's kind of a lot to deal with as a child. Again, they're fucking children. And I think that's the saddest part about this, that this is kids killing kids. Again, 15 people died, including them. And I do think that's sad. We will talk about people in this season that survive. Our next episode, she survives. And yes, I said she. So before we're closing up this one, are they psychopaths? Again, a psychopath is not a diagnosis. they are children, meaning they cannot have antisocial personality disorder, but they can display signs and traits of psychopathy. So, looking at the Harris checklist or the PCL-R, the psychopath checklist, whatever you want to call it, let's see what they got. Glib and superficial charm. No, they don't. Because if they were picked on and they were bullied and all this stuff, they didn't really have that. If anyone did, maybe it was Eric, because he was really good at like manipulating people, and he kind of bragged about that, that people, liked him and passed him on probation and all that kind of stuff. So maybe a little bit for Eric. Grandiose estimation of self. Yeah, I mean, I think that to put yourself in a space of being godlike, quote unquote, is definitely an exaggeratedly high estimation of self. Need for stimulation, absolutely. Video games, making homemade weapons, their obsession with guns and military, making movies, doing all this stuff, absolutely is a need for stimulation. Pathological lying. I don't know. That's an interesting one. I think it would actually be really hard to differentiate normal teenage lying and manipulation from pathological lying. So I'm not sure on that one. Cunning and manipulativeness. Again, maybe more on Eric's part, but not in a really overt way. Lack of remorse or guilt. They killed themselves. And that was actually always part of the plan, was for them to kill as many people as they could and themselves. I don't know that that is necessarily them showing remorse or guilt, but in those basement tapes, they did apologize to their parents and to their friends. But Eric says, like, I'm so sorry, but this has to happen, where he's not really taking accountability for the fact that he's the one doing it. He's kind of saying, like, yeah, I can apologize, but it is what it is. Shallow affect. I have seen pictures of them, and you can actually watch some of their videos and stuff that they recorded. I don't think that they have shallow affect at all. But again, they could have been like acting or whatever. Callousness or lack of empathy. Again, I don't know. In their videos, Dylan appears more apologetic than Eric. Parasitic lifestyles, well, they're children. Children are basically parasites, but not in the way that this is saying it. They're not surviving off of taking advantage of other people. Poor behavior controls, absolutely. But again, they're teenagers, so it's really hard to kind of differentiate those two. But the fact that, again, they did all this stuff, they shot a bunch of people, is potentially poor behavior controls, but it was very, very skillful and planned and all of that. So not so much. Sexual promiscuity. No, not at all. Not at all. Early behavior problems. Yep. They are children. These are early behavior problems. Lack of realistic long-term goals. So one of the potential kind of like triggers for this event is that a lot of people say or have said that Eric may have not gotten into the military, and that was his long-term goal, but because he was prescribed medications and, this probation stuff and whatever, that he had been denied, and that was his long-term goal. So I do think that they had goals. Impulsivity. This is a very, very planned attack. I don't really think that they were being very impulsive. Irresponsibility. They both started working in 7th grade. They were skipping classes and stuff, but they weren't bad students. I don't think so. Failure to accept responsibility for own actions. Again, in their videos, they are saying like, hey, we're doing this. I do think that's that's their version of acceptance. It might not be very apologetic like we want it to be, but it does seem like they're taking responsibility for the fact that they want to do this and are going to do it. Many short-term marital relationships, nope, doesn't apply. Juvenile delinquency, yeah, they had a couple of those arrests and stuff. Revocation of conditional release also doesn't apply. And criminal versatility, fairly. They had like the one theft and the one hacking and then this, of course. So I don't know that they're psychopaths, which is actually kind of interesting because I feel like almost everybody I've covered so far is like, well, duh, they're a psychopath. But this is where you get that kind of debate between nature versus nurture. Did they really have choice in this? You know, did they do this out of spite and because they're psychopaths and they want to kill people? Did they do this because they were paranoid and potentially delusional? Did they do this, you know, because they wanted to kill themselves and they just wanted to take other people out with them? I don't know. I also think that them being children makes it really hard. It's really hard to look at a child and say this child is a psychopath. And I used to work with kids and I 100% have looked at children and be like, they're going to kill people one day. This child is a psychopath. It does happen, but I do think it's a very, very rare and it's very hard to see that without having so much time, like looking at a Ted Bundy or anybody else that's like lived their whole lives and you can kind of look at like their work history and all this other stuff. But because these were babies, 17 and 18, and they killed other fucking babies. And it's so sad. And of course, that's going to be, I think, the hardest part about talking about all of these is that they are children. But something to take into consideration is that these two kids on the outside and per report had very normal lives. You have to take that into account with that nature versus nurture. Were they born psychopaths? Were they born to kill people? I don't know. But I do hope that at the very least that's a discussion and maybe I told you a little bit about what's wrong with them.
Thanks again for listening to True Crime by Indie Drop-In. If you would like your show featured, reach out to us at Indie Drop-In on all social media or go to indiedropin.com. See you next time.